Douglas MacArthur stood in knee-deep surf, moving deliberately toward a Philippine beach while a dozen photographers recorded every step. It was October 20, 1944. The Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific wasn't focused on the tactical situation unfolding around him. He was focused on the image. The beach had not been fully secured. Japanese snipers were still active in the tree line. American infantry units were still clearing defensive positions just inland. Offshore, naval commanders scrambled to provide emergency protection for a general who had decided to remain exposed hours before anyone believed it was safe. Air cover had to be rerouted. Gunfire support had to be repositioned. Ground troops had to shift their priorities to protect a man posing for cameras. MacArthur did not care. This was not a military operation, it was theater. When MacArthur fled the Philippines in 1942, he left behind a promise: I shall return. Now he intended to fulfill it in the most dramatic way possible, even if it meant risking his life, his staff, and the soldiers around him for a photograph. The cameras captured exactly what he wanted: the stern-faced general striding through the surf, returning to liberate the Philippines. Within 48 hours, the image was on the front page of nearly every major newspaper in America. Back in Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt would soon learn what his Pacific commander had done. He would be furious. But the real question was whether he would do anything about it. When reports of the Leyte landing reached the White House, they confirmed a pattern that had been developing for more than 2 years. MacArthur had once again staged a publicity spectacle in an active combat zone. Naval commanders had not been informed. Air support had been scrambled at the last moment. Combat units had been diverted from their missions. Under normal circumstances, such behavior would have resulted in a formal reprimand at minimum. But Roosevelt had learned something since 1942. Douglas MacArthur was untouchable. Time and again, MacArthur exceeded his authority, publicly questioned strategy, or staged dramatic gestures designed for headlines rather than battlefield necessity. And time and again, Roosevelt complained privately, but acted not at all. The political cost of disciplining America's most popular general was simply too high. Roosevelt understood exactly what MacArthur was doing. The Leyte landing was not about military necessity. It was designed to dominate American newspapers, and it worked. The risks taken, the resources diverted, and the danger imposed on soldiers would never appear in the glowing press coverage. Roosevelt also understood his own political reality. Republicans openly discussed MacArthur as a potential presidential candidate. Conservative newspapers praised him relentlessly. Any attempt to discipline MacArthur would trigger a political firestorm that could undermine Roosevelt's control of the war effort itself. So Roosevelt made the same calculation he had made since 1942. He would tolerate MacArthur's behavior because the alternative was politically unacceptable. That choice set a precedent, one that would haunt his successor. MacArthur had gotten away with it again. To understand why Roosevelt felt powerless to stop him, you have to return to 1942, the moment MacArthur became the most famous general in America. In March 1942, as Japanese forces overran the Philippines, Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to escape. The president could not afford to lose America's most recognizable commander to capture. MacArthur reached Australia and immediately delivered a statement that would define his public image for the rest of the war. I came through, and I shall return. It was perfect, short, dramatic, personal. The press embraced it instantly. The American public, desperate for heroes after months of defeat, embraced it even more. MacArthur became the face of America's war in the Pacific overnight. But the reality on the ground looked very different. While newspapers portrayed MacArthur as a fearless warrior, his soldiers had another name for him. Behind his back, they called him Dugout Doug. They saw a general who stayed safely behind the lines while they fought, starved, and died. That gap between MacArthur's public image and the reality his troops experienced would persist throughout the war. For the men left behind on Bataan, the headlines felt like betrayal. They were eating mule meat, riddled with malaria, running out of ammunition, and listening to radio broadcasts celebrating the commander who had escaped to comfort in Australia. Dugout Doug wasn't a joke, it was bitterness. Roosevelt recognized immediately that MacArthur had become both indispensable and dangerous. Republicans openly floated him as a possible challenger in 1944. Conservative media elevated him constantly. Roosevelt needed MacArthur to fight the war, but he also needed to ensure MacArthur didn't become powerful enough to challenge civilian authority. That calculation shaped every decision Roosevelt made over the next 3 years. In July 1942, Roosevelt met with the Joint Chiefs to determine Pacific strategy. 2 options were on the table. The Central Pacific route, led by Admiral Nimitz, would move through the Marshalls and Marianas toward Japan. The Southwest Pacific route would fight its way through New Guinea and the Philippines. The Joint Chiefs overwhelmingly favored the Central Pacific. It was shorter, relied on naval and carrier power, and promised faster results. General Marshall supported it, Admiral King supported it even more aggressively. Roosevelt approved the recommendation. The Central Pacific would be the main effort. MacArthur's theater would be secondary. Douglas MacArthur refused to accept that. Instead of making his case through military channels, he launched a public relations campaign. He gave interviews, leaked classified information, and cultivated relationships with Republican congressmen. He framed strategic disagreement as political betrayal. It was extraordinary insubordination. Roosevelt saw it all. He complained privately, but he never acted. By 1944, MacArthur had successfully manipulated public opinion into believing that liberating the Philippines was a moral obligation. Bypassing them became politically impossible. Roosevelt was cornered. So he gave MacArthur what he wanted. The Philippines would be invaded. Military judgment yielded to political pressure. MacArthur's return at Leyte was the culmination of that manipulation, a carefully staged production designed to immortalize him in history. And it succeeded. Roosevelt knew what MacArthur had done, and once again, he did nothing. That refusal to enforce discipline had consequences far beyond World War II. After Roosevelt's death, Harry Truman inherited the problem Roosevelt had avoided. Unlike his predecessor, Truman understood that civilian control of the military was not optional. When MacArthur repeated the same behavior during the Korean War, publicly defying policy and attempting to dictate strategy, Truman acted. In April 1951, Truman relieved MacArthur of command. The political backlash was immediate and severe, but Truman did not waver. Roosevelt had chosen expediency. Truman chose principle. MacArthur had learned under Roosevelt that popularity made him untouchable. Truman taught him otherwise. History would ultimately judge which lesson mattered more. Douglas MacArthur's career did not end with defeat on the battlefield. It ended with a lesson, one that American democracy had been slow to enforce, and one that Franklin Roosevelt had repeatedly avoided. For nearly a decade, MacArthur operated under a simple assumption, that public popularity outweighed military discipline, and that presidents would bend rather than confront him. For most of World War II, that assumption was correct. Roosevelt was not blind to MacArthur's behavior. He saw the publicity stunts, the strategic leaks, the political maneuvering, and the repeated challenges to civilian authority. He understood the danger of a general who believed himself larger than the chain of command. But Roosevelt made the same calculation over and over again. MacArthur was too popular. Disciplining him would provoke backlash. Firing him might fracture public support during a global war. And so Roosevelt chose political expediency over enforcement. That choice carried a cost. By tolerating MacArthur's insubordination, Roosevelt weakened one of the most fundamental principles of American governance, civilian control of the military. Generals are not elected. They do not set national policy. They serve at the pleasure of the president. Roosevelt understood this in theory, but in practice he allowed one man to operate beyond those constraints because confronting him seemed politically dangerous. MacArthur learned from that tolerance. He learned that leaking information worked. He learned that manipulating public opinion forced strategic outcomes. He learned that presidents could be cornered. Most dangerously, he learned that consequences could be avoided as long as he remained popular. Other generals noticed as well. Across Europe and the Pacific, officers who followed orders, respected authority, and accepted discipline watched MacArthur operate under a different set of rules. They saw Patton punished for misconduct, Montgomery restrained by command authority, and capable officers relieved for mistakes, while MacArthur publicly defied strategy and staged theatrical landings without repercussion. The message was corrosive. Discipline applied selectively. George Marshall understood the danger immediately. He worried that Roosevelt was teaching the wrong lesson, that political connections mattered more than obedience, that public image could override command structure, and that insubordination could be rewarded if it was popular enough. Marshall was right. The precedent Roosevelt set did not end with the war. Harry Truman inherited it. Unlike Roosevelt, Truman had no emotional investment in MacArthur's myth. He had not watched the general rise to fame in 1942. He had not relied on him as a symbol during America's darkest hours. Truman was a former artillery officer who understood hierarchy and responsibility. To him, MacArthur's behavior was not dramatic, it was unacceptable. At first, Truman tolerated MacArthur for practical reasons. Japan needed stability. Korea demanded experienced leadership. But Truman also paid attention. He documented. He waited. And when MacArthur repeated the same pattern, unauthorized diplomacy, public defiance, political pressure, Truman recognized it immediately. This was the same behavior Roosevelt had allowed, and Truman decided it would stop with him. When MacArthur publicly challenged presidential policy in 1951, Truman acted without hesitation. He relieved him of command not because MacArthur was ineffective on the battlefield, but because he was dangerous to the constitutional order. The backlash was severe. Truman's approval ratings collapsed. Protesters filled the streets. Congress erupted. But Truman did not reverse course. In doing so, he restored a principle Roosevelt had compromised. The contrast between the two presidents is stark. Roosevelt chose stability through accommodation. Truman chose stability through enforcement. Roosevelt believed the political cost of disciplining MacArthur was too high. Truman believed the cost of not disciplining him was higher. History has largely vindicated Truman. The Senate hearings that followed MacArthur's dismissal exposed the full extent of his insubordination. They revealed how frequently he had exceeded authority, ignored directives, and attempted to shape policy independently of civilian leadership. They confirmed what Marshall, King, and Eisenhower had understood for years. MacArthur was not merely difficult, he was incompatible with civilian control. MacArthur's career ended not with a final victory, but with a correction. He had been allowed to believe that his popularity placed him above accountability. Truman proved otherwise. In doing so, he reaffirmed a principle older than any general and more important than any war, that the military answers to elected leadership, not public opinion. Franklin Roosevelt remains one of America's greatest presidents. His leadership through Depression and World War was extraordinary. But his handling of Douglas MacArthur was a failure, not of intelligence or awareness, but of resolve. Roosevelt chose political safety over institutional integrity, and the consequences lingered long after his death. MacArthur himself is not easily categorized. He was brilliant, theatrical, deeply flawed, and profoundly ambitious. He inspired devotion and resentment in equal measure. He won victories and created crises. But his greatest impact may not be military at all. It was the stress test he imposed on American democracy, a test that Roosevelt postponed and Truman ultimately passed. The story of Douglas MacArthur is not simply about ego or ambition. It is about power, accountability, and the fragile balance between military necessity and democratic control. It is a reminder that even successful leaders must be constrained, and that popularity is not a substitute for obedience to law. Roosevelt believed confronting MacArthur would weaken the war effort. Truman believed failing to confront him would weaken the Republic. In the end, history suggests Truman was right. MacArthur once believed he was untouchable. Roosevelt allowed him to believe it. Truman proved him wrong. That difference defines both presidencies, and it defines the enduring lesson of Douglas MacArthur's rise and fall.